we just made this macro regime shift call. You could move from Larsen to Lever on time. And I probably feel that that might be reversing again now. I mean, Lever is already, it's not underperforming, but it's like kind of flattish, and Larsen is showing some signs of life. So those drivers of the economy might be changing one more time.
Hello, listeners. My name is Raj Singhal, and welcome to another episode of Breaking Investment Stereotypes. This episode is brought to you by Multiply.co, where we believe that investing is an ignored life skill. Our mission is to create a platform where people can come learn, share, and collaborate through the right tools. Ultimately, we want your hard-earned money to work for you. Here at Breaking Investment Stereotypes, my job is to deconstruct world-class investors and portfolio managers and deep dive into their investing journey, personally, professionally, or both. I want to give a little guidance on how to use these shows. None of the following should be taken as an investment advice. Please see multiply.co/disclosures for more information. Hey, Swaran, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks for having me on this.
Yeah. Swaran, it's been very interesting, your life journey so far, especially the whole sabbatical. And it's very rare for a young people like you and at your age and stage of career to do that. And I'm sure, a lot of people must have asked you about it, and you've written a whole chronicle around that. But, we would like to hear more about that and also just your life in general.
Oh, sure. It's a broad question. I think that can consume the entire hour, but I'm going to
Go on,
try and
all
make
yours.
it crisp.
Yeah, all yours.
So I'll start in the reverse. So I'll talk about the sabbatical, since that's the question you asked. So I took a sabbatical starting February 2020. What timing? For a year, and I came back to Morgan Stanley in Feb 2021. So that was the year when I was out of my corporate job. The idea was to explore certain skills, certain things that I always wanted to, but the pushes and pulls of corporate job and just life in general keep you from exploring those things. And it's always been sort of, I wouldn't call it a bucket list, but something that I've always wanted to do before, you're physically unable to do it. And I said, I turned 40 recently. So I said, this is a great time to kind of introspect, look back, and at the same time, look forward in terms of what you want to do. And that's where this idea of a sabbatical came from. I wanted it to be a structured 1 year, wherein I decided that I'm going to learn 7-8 things that I wanted to. Originally started with a plan of 12, but kind of COVID put a spanner in the works. So I said I want to learn these 7-8 things. I structured a learning plan around it, a month and a half for each. I worked with a teacher for all of them. So it started off with yoga. I learned how to dance a bit. I learned how to cook. I learned how to play. I mean, I trained for a month and a bit at the Gary Kirsten Cricket Academy. I worked on my personal fitness because that was an area which I really wanted to work on. So all those things put together, the year was, I would say, the most impactful year of my life. Very happy to do it. Before that, I have been with Morgan Stanley. I joined Morgan Stanley in 2007 as an analyst, and I spent 14 years there. I look at the Indian public equities in the asset management business, which basically is, to put it very simply, it's a mutual fund, but like a mutual fund, but the only difference is that the investors are foreigners. They are foreign institutional investors and not Indian investors. So that's the only difference, but we invest in equity markets just like any mutual fund would do. I graduated from IIM Ahmedabad in 2005. I'm a chartered accountant. I'm reeling this backward now. I'm a chartered accountant. I qualified in 2002. So that's been the life journey, been on the buy side all through my post-grad career since 2005 till now. It's been like 16 years on the buy side. I've been with Fidelity, HSBC, and my longest stint was with Morgan Stanley.
Okay, that's awesome. So we'll pick some of the aspects of your sabbatical from here on. So, I read in your chronicle, and you said that you were not expecting to go from this whole Gangadhar to Shaktiman, and this is you picked up from this Shaktiman TV serial in 8 weeks. But how far into that you actually became Shaktiman in this whole process?
So I think the one realization was that So somebody goes from Gangadhar to Shaktiman only in a story, only in a fictional tale. In real life, nobody goes from Gangadhar to Shaktiman. In real life, you go from Gangadhar to becoming a better Gangadhar. Right? When I say that, what do I mean? I mean, if Shaktiman is a full stop, right? Shaktiman is somebody who's become a superhero. There is nothing further to do. Shaktiman has achieved all that he wants to. He can do all that he wants to. But a Gangadhar is still trying. A Gangadhar is still trying to improve on yesterday, but at no point is he saying that this is done. Right. So I don't think in real life you become Shaktiman, be it as an investor, be it if you're learning a new skill. I think even if you ask Warren Buffett, I mean, who's the presiding DP of all investors, I don't think even he'll say he's Shaktiman. He'll say, I'm a better Gangadhar than yesterday, and I hope to be a better Gangadhar tomorrow than I am today. So I use that in the context of the fact that a lot of people embark on any learning or any improvement or any productivity journey hoping for miraculous results in very short spans of time. They're expecting to go from Gangadhar to Shaktiman in 1 year. But the sabbatical has reinforced my thinking that in real life, nobody becomes Shaktiman.
Yeah. I've been a strong believer that in life, frankly, there is no destination. It's all about the journey. So till the time you enjoy this whole process of, improving every day as a Gangadhar, that's what life is all about. Another interesting thing I picked up from your chronicle is about, sending this dozen no agenda meetings to some of your close friends, and also to some of those Murari Lals, and which you picked as Murari Lal from this movie Anand, about, Rajesh Khanna talking to Johnny Walker and calling him as a Murari Lal without knowing his name. Curious to know, how many such interesting meetings, and tell us more about that. Especially
I'll give you
Murari Lals.
context of what I was, I'll give you a context of what I was trying to do, right? I mean, before I went on this sabbatical, I decided that for almost 2.5 months, I went on a personal project of digital minimalism. It was actually inspired by a book by the same name, Digital Minimalism, wherein you minimize your use of technology to only the stuff that you really care about. Right? So I deleted a ton of apps. I deleted Instagram. I deleted YouTube. I deleted Facebook. Deleted a lot of things. And what that created was, it created a large amount of time in my life. Right? So I ended up creating almost 2.5 hours in my life by deleting all those things. And I said, what do I do with this 2.5 hours that I have created? I mean, I can go to sleep. I mean, that's great. I mean, instead of sleeping 7.5 hours, I can sleep for 10. But I said, what is the best use of this time that has suddenly become available to me? And I said, I'm going to write to a few people. Some of them I know, some of them I know of, but I know them well. And just seek a meeting, saying that this is what I've liked about you, I've been impressed about. Can we just meet? So I used to write in the subject line, request for a no agenda meeting. Right? And some of them were friends, some of them were people I know. Some of them were people, as I said, I know of. And you'll be surprised. I mean, I had a great hit rate on asking for these meetings. I mean, the number of people who said, yes, come over, let's chat. I mean, and no agendas. I mean, I don't want to take anything out of it as a predetermined agenda. So I met a lot of people. And I actually wrote down some of my meeting notes from those 8, 10, 12 meetings that I had over the 2.5 month period. And some of them were really insightful, right? I mean, and that's my learning, that when you're meeting somebody without an agenda, you kind of get to see that real person. If you are meeting if you as an investor, you're meeting a corporate, both of you are putting a facade. Right? The investor wants to ensure that the corporate is telling you everything. The corporate wants to ensure that they're putting their best foot forward. So but you're just meeting without anything, right? It's just like two people meeting. I think those meetings are the most insightful. That, I mean, helps you know that real person, what he or she thinks, what are their core beliefs. And I had some great meetings that way from some senior industry leaders, some investors that I really like and respect. And one of the columns that I recently wrote for Bloomberg Quint about out-knowing, out-analyzing, and out-behaving. That column actually came out of a conversation with Rashesh Shah, which happened in 2017. So that's almost a 4-year-old conversation, which was part of these no agenda meetings. And that the way he said it, it's kind of remained with me for 4 years. It was there in the back of my head. And even after 4 years, I could write it as a column almost in like 2 hours. So some of those meetings were very impactful. You get to learn a lot from people with experiences, and not just from financial field or investors. I met people from diverse backgrounds, and it was very educative. I mean, I would love to do it again. I mean, I just need to structure my life a bit better and carve out those times. And hopefully, as physical meetings improve, I think I'll have the opportunity to do it.
Okay, that's interesting. Now let's talk about this whole investing journey which you've going through. And as part of this whole, you've been part of this Morgan Stanley for such a long period, and I'm sure I've been a macro trader all my life. You have to contemplate macro versus micro. I mean, I only saw the whole macro thing, but as an equity investor, you probably guys think a lot more about macro versus micro. And this whole macro is becoming very interesting nowadays, with a lot of people talking about whether inflation is back, especially in US context or developed market context. What do you think, as a retail investor, do they really need to bother about macro?
So I think you can answer this in two parts. I mean, I'll tell you as an institutional investor how I use macro. The way I used to do it is our investing time horizon. So when we initiate a position in a company, our typical starting point horizons are 18 to 24 months. We are holding a stock or writing a rationale for that stock with an 18 to 24 month visibility, which does not mean that we are selling the stock per force in 2 years, but that is your starting point visibility that you have in terms of the business fundamentals or even the macro fundamentals. So as investors, we start off with that time frame. And the way I have tried to use macro is to use a set of extremely high frequency indicators, be it commercial vehicle sales, be it airline traffic, be it port loading, be it credit growth, just a whole host. I mean, 30, 40, I mean, we had created a dashboard. And as to look at a whole host of macroeconomic, high frequency macroeconomic indicators, just to see what is the internals of the economy, what areas of the economy are picking up steam, what areas of the economy are losing steam. And if they're losing steam, why are they losing steam? Are they likely to come back? What of this is structural? What of this is? So it effectively became a starting point for questions for me. Just looking at this set of high frequency indicators, and these are now very easily available. In fact, even RBI refers to them and maintains a dashboard of these high frequency indicators. So that was the most critical macro input into my investing process. And it was an input in the sense it used to nudge me towards sectors, saying, this is something which seems to be picking up. This is something that seems to be cooling off. Can we explore this a bit further? Are there names to be explored? So that was how I used to primarily use macro. I used to never care about what the next inflation print is going to be. But what I used to, I mean, unlike, let's say, fixed income trader, but what I used to care about is to understand what macroeconomic regime are we in. So when I say macroeconomic regime, what do you mean? For an equity investor, for a growth equity investor, I think what matters is what are the macroeconomic drivers of growth, right? I mean, that's the main thing that you're focusing on. And to give you an example, I mean, a lot of people who say that we are pure bottom-up guys, we don't care about what's happening in the macro. But if I can give you an example, if you remember the first decade of this millennium, from 2000 to 2010, it was all about Larsen and Toubro. Right, from 2003 till 2009, 2008, Larsen had this fabulous run. I think the stock went up some 6-7x, and Lever was flat. Right, a lot of people have forgotten the fact that it was called the Lever's lost decade. From 2000 to 2010, Lever returned nothing. Hindustan Unilever was a flat stock. And the basic underlying macro reason at the broadest level was the fact that the economy was driven by the supply side. The economy was being driven by capital expenditure. It was being driven by creation of new capacities. And consumption as a driver was much more subdued. Right? So it was an economy which was more an investment-led economy, and consumption was much more subdued, and that showed in the stock price returns for some of these stocks. Come to 2009, and you had this one big mega fiscal stimulus after the financial meltdown, and these drivers reversed. So if you look at the 2010 to 2020 decade, it's pretty much a lost decade for Larsen, whereas Hindustan Unilever is now up multifold, which is because of the fact that the fiscal stimulus, which was more a consumer-oriented fiscal stimulus, that put money into the hands of the consumer, they went out and bought stuff, right? So if you just had, I'm just giving a very broad example, and if you just made this macro regime shift call, you could move from Larsen to lever on time. And I probably feel that might be reversing again now. I mean, lever is already, it's not underperforming, but it's like kind of flattish, and last time it's showing some signs of life. So those drivers of the economy might be changing one more time. So as a macro investor, if you can figure out that, okay, I feel the next 5 years, this is going to be the predominant driver of growth, I think then you can orient your stock picking in that direction, right? But there is no getting out of stock picking. I mean, there is my favorite analogy for this is the macro regime is like the pitch on which you play cricket, right? But at the end of the day, you still have to make runs, and that runs is about stock picking. Yeah. So you will have a bouncy wicket, you will have a spinning wicket. Once in a while, you'll play in Chepauk, you'll play at Perth, you will play at maybe you play in England where the ball is swinging much. So you need to know the context in which the stock picking is happening. But at the end of the day, it's the runs that you need to make. The context of the stock picking will help you prefer certain shots over others. But that's all there is to it. Just by reading the pitch really well, you're not going to make runs.
I want to dwell a little bit deeper into that. But before that, first, I just want to understand one more thing. I think you mentioned in one of somewhere that one of your biggest mistake was actually making pure macro call. So maybe you want to talk a little bit more detail about that. But secondly, I think you interestingly you mentioned about whether this decade is again shifting around this whole consumer versus capex, I guess. And if your thought is more developed on that, probably let's talk more detail on that. So let's talk about both those aspects.
Sure. So let me pick up the pure macro thing, right? So let me give it a live example. Let's say taper tantrum, not a live example, but an actual example. Let's say taper tantrum happened in August 2013, right? I mean, if you remember, the Fed talked about tapering for the first time, and India, having high current account and high fiscal deficit, went through a period of big dislocation, a macro dislocation. And by November, December 2013, things had started to stabilize. Let's say you are a pure India macro watcher and you had the foresight to make the call that this seems to be the bottom for India and I now want to buy India, right? As a macro view on the country, that things have had a free fall, but they're now stabilizing. And from here on, I feel things will gradually start to improve. And you, let's say, bought without doing much research. You say, okay, this is an India macro call. What macro, a lot of macro people do is try and end up buying the largest bank in the country because a bank is a levered macro play. You would have bought, let's say, either an SBI or an ICICI bank, and they would have done nothing for you for the next 2.5 years, right? Not because your macro call went wrong, but you did not do enough legwork on the specific issues that the banks were facing. There were either leadership issues or there were a lagged effect of credit quality and those kind of things. So I think I made a pure macro call once on a financial stock, saying that, okay, things seem to be bottoming, things seem to be reversing, and I need to buy the largest bank out there. I don't care too much about what's happening within the specifics of the bank. I mean, is the NIM improving? What is happening to cost ratios? What is happening to credit cost, etc.? And that didn't really work out too well. So I think you need to be able to do both. You need to be able to assess what the macro setting is, and then be able to do enough work on the stock itself to ensure that there is no loss in translation, that your macro call is correctly reflected in the stock as well. So yeah, so that was the first part where I made a pure macro call and probably didn't go right. There's a second part of your question.
Yeah, so I was talking about, you mentioned that maybe we are again at the flux of changing over of that whole consumer versus, I guess, capex cycle. So
yeah,
probably want
so I think in a way this is a bit mathematical, right, and almost textbookish in the sense that the supply change in any economy is a step function, or supply chain for any new thing is like you have a supply for a certain time, then you have new supply coming, and then it stabilizes. Whereas the demand is kind of a smoother function. Right? And if you understand this broad dynamic at a multiple decade level, you will get a sense of when to move from the demand drivers to the supply drivers. So supply comes about, I mean, think about it in the classic commodity terms. Commodity prices are really high right now, okay, and they're likely to remain high for the next year, couple of years. Producers will now create capacity. That capacity will come on stream over the next 4 or 5 years, by which time demand might start weakening. You will have an overcapacity problem. Demand will then steadily grow, by which time there will be a price overheat and the cycle will repeat itself. So I think that is what will happen. That, I mean, the one thing to look at is utilization levels, which is where basically demand meets supply, and across a whole host of industries. And that gives you a sense on where to shift from one part to the other. So I'm not saying this is happening tomorrow, but if I were a betting man and if I were to bet for the next, let's say, decade, I would say this is Larsen again over Lieber.
Okay, that's very interesting. The other thing, I mean, you run India portfolio for Morgan Stanley, and Morgan Stanley is a big international house. So I'm sure, that was part of the emerging market team, and you'd have seen other emerging market as being part of the overall investing team as well. But India has always been, very high on valuation as compared to many other emerging markets, including China as well. And again, I recently saw some data that, India has received a larger proportion of emerging market inflows. Probably some of that could be what is happening in China as well. What's your thought on this whole India premium, which has been there for decades, I would say?
Yeah, so I think the India premium versus MSCI EM, MSCI emerging markets in general, that includes China, has several elements to it, right? One, again, as I said, is a purely mathematical element. So a lot of emerging markets is a very commodity heavy, financials heavy index. So if you look at places like Russia, Brazil, I mean, almost 50 to 70% of their indices would comprise of either financials or material stocks, which is basically oil, copper, iron ore, those kind of things. Now, by definition, these industries tend to be low P industries, right? So when you're comparing a composite which is heavy on energy, material, financials versus a composite which is heavy on tech versus which is heavy on consumer, they're naturally going to find one is more expensive than the other just because of the sheer composition of the two indices, right? So that is something that we have always talked about in India, saying that we need to adjust for the index composition when we compare just the headline PE ratio of one market versus the other. The other thing about India is that it's just the diversity of stocks and sectors. I mean, we did this analysis, I think, 2-3 years ago. And India at that point in time, I'm sure that number is now expanded, had 350 companies with a market cap in excess of $1 billion, which is a fairly large sum, it's a very large number of companies, even for institutional investors. And there was only US, China, and maybe Germany, which had more number of listed companies with a market cap in excess of $1 billion. You'll be surprised some of the large markets in emerging markets like Russia, Brazil barely had double-digit billion-dollar companies. It basically means that as an investor, I am going to be coming to India just because the pool is big. My ability to invest across sectors in fairly large companies is fairly high here. And coupled with the fact that if you think about it in nominal GDP terms, and that's what matters for an equity investor, there are very few places where you get a combination of size and growth, right? I mean, India has grown nominal GDP double digit for most part of last decade. Forget the last couple of years because they were dislocations. So you get a large pool of companies which are growing fairly fast. It's very natural that they'll attract investor interest. I mean, that's as simple as that. And on top of that, there is sector diversity, which means that the capital, even if it is foreign portfolio capital, is much more stickier. To put it bluntly, let's say if you have a negative view on oil and commodities, it's very difficult for you to invest in Russia. I mean, yeah, you might find one retailer there or something of that sort, but the bulk of the Russian index becomes uninvestable for you if you don't like oil. And there's no such thing, right? Because the Indian market is not hostage to one macroeconomic factor. Let's say even in the worst of times like 2012 and 13, when the domestic conditions were not so great, you could actually very well run an outward facing portfolio in India. I mean, have pharma and tech companies as the bulk of your portfolio, which are more exporters and benefited from currency weakness. So I think that is the thing that draws more and more investors to India. The last thing I'll say about it is that India is probably one of the few markets, apart from maybe US, where you get stock market compounders, right? What I mean by compounders? That they keep giving you returns consistently over long periods of time. If you see markets which are more cyclical in nature, like let's say the tech hardware cycle is actually a cycle, right? And markets in Korea, Taiwan, which are more exposed to the tech hardware cycle, they can give point-to-point returns which are better, let's say, than India, but will have a deep cyclicality within that return, right? So you need to be able to capture that 18-month period really correctly to make the bulk of the return. versus let's say an HDFC Bank, which you can sit on for 2 decades. Right? So as an investor, I am more attracted towards the latter, right? Which are more secular compounding stories, rather than having to time a cyclical play, which is where again India gets a lot of this money. I mean, if you see, look at a lot of the foreign institutional investor portfolios who have been there for a long time. The portfolio churn has hardly been anything. Right? I mean, I remember this, that when I joined Morgan Stanley in 2007, we used to own HDFC Bank. We still owned it. I mean, until 2021, May 2021, till the point I was with MS, we still had HDFC Bank for the entire 16 or entire 15-year period. We have owned HDFC Bank always. Right? So I can't think about any other market within our portfolio which has had a stock which has been there for all 50 years. Right? Things come and go out. So I think that is some of the exact numbers. I haven't looked at how much is the premium as it expanded, it shrunk. But I think India as a market will always remain at a premium to emerging markets.
I think it's interesting to talk about this whole compounders, and we got a few of the other guys before, on this podcast, and including Saurabh Mukherjee, who also talks about this whole compounder thing. But there are probably like 50 stocks like that. There may be 350 stocks which are about $1 billion. But again, the pool becomes smaller if you look for the compounders. So how do you, look through that? I mean, one is a larger pool, but within that, there are only small set of the players who are probably long-term, who can think from the long-term investing.
Yeah. So the thing that happens is, for a minute, just assume that you are not a domestic investor. You are somebody who can allocate money across markets, who can allocate money across emerging markets. What that means is you basically need 10 stocks in India. You don't need more than 10 stocks.
Yeah, true.
Right? Because you are going to have an emerging market portfolio which has got, let's say 100 stocks. India's weight in MSCI is about 10%. Or even if you want to look at the weight and figure out how much money you want to put there, you need 10 stocks. You don't need too much more than that. And those 10 compounding stocks you easily find, right? I mean, as a institutional investor, what am I trying to do? I'm not just trying to hit the ball out of the park. I also want to ensure that it comes at low risks. I also want to ensure that there's not much volatility in that return, because at the end of the day, it's not because I'm a wimp. It's because of the fact that the people who have given me the money to manage need consistent returns. They are pension funds who have a pension liability which they need to meet every year. And their hurdle for, if I generate a 50% return, they're going to pat me on my back, but they cannot put up with a -5, because that means that the pension becomes underfunded. So that's how my risk reward is stacked. I want to ensure a good return, but I also doubly want to ensure that the downside draws are not too bad. So which is why even if you have a pool of 50 compounders, I think that's good enough for me.
That's interesting. So you mentioned about this whole article about which in Bloomberg Quint about this whole 3 sources of superior returns: out knowing, out analyzing, and out behaving. Do you want to talk more in details? And especially I want to pick up on this whole out behaving, because investing is also a lot about behavior. Analysis a lot of people can do, but behavior is something which is very individual in nature.
Sure. No, absolutely. So just to give you a one-line summary of that article, I said that on a long-term basis, there are 3 sources of alpha. And when we say alpha, it means superior return versus the market. One is out knowing. It's basically you know more than I do. It's just information arbitrage. The second source is out analyzing. Both of us have the same data, but I have looked at it with a better perspective, analyzed it better. And the third source is out behaving. Both of us have the same data. Both of us have analyzed it the similar way, but we have behaved differently in the market in terms of how we bought or sold stocks or equities in general. And my conclusion there, and it was more a heuristic than a research-driven number, that investors tend to spend 80% of their time trying to outknow each other. Right? We have an obsession with khabar. We have an obsession with knowing one bit of information more than the next guy. And 80% of the time gets spent there. Maybe 15% gets spent in out analyzing. You try and come out, try and make cross-industry linkages, try and look out data, try to zoom out a bit. And very little is spent on out behavior. But if you look at just the long-term investing outcomes, the numbers are exactly the reverse. 80% of your returns on a long term, and when I say long term, only 10 years and more, come from out behaving, come from not losing your nerve at market bottoms. maybe 15% comes from out analyzing, and only 5% once in a while you will get something from out knowing. Just by knowing something because you read an economist article which I didn't, and which is why you knew something which I didn't, and you were able to capitalize on. But those are very rare. So that's the summary of the article. Now, when it comes to out behaving, I think the one important thing that investors need to know, and which you should practice even if you're putting out even 100 rupees in the market, is to be able to self-analyze. I think that is one of the most critical aspects of investing. And what Daniel Kahneman says at system 1 and system 2, you should be able to see yourself thinking. The portfolio that I own, a stock that I own is down 30% today. What are the reactions that I'm going through? What are the feelings that I'm going through? What are the emotions that I'm going through? You should be able to observe it yourself. Right? It's like you have two voices in your head, two different voices. Right? You can go the conspiracy theory route. Right? That somebody is trying to tank this stock because they want to buy it tomorrow, which is fine. This is how you have reacted, but you should be able to see that you are reacting in that way. And that's how your biases start coming out. And once you have enough data of this sort, enough action replay of your own thoughts, your biases tend to come out. My bias is that I sometimes tend to equate investing or buying or selling stock with winning or losing. Right? So I tend to take it personally. So let's say I have bought a stock at 300 rupees. I'm extremely loath to sell it at 250. Right? Because in my mind, it is equivalent to accepting defeat. I have accepted intellectual defeat by buying something at 300 and not being able to sell at 250. And then my tendency, thankfully, I have the second mind also observing and telling me this, but my tendency is to find excuse. Right? My tendency is to get bullheaded about it, saying that no, I am going to, this is about grit. This is about just holding on to things. Right? But there's a famous Kenshin quote that when facts change, I change my opinion, and you need to try and work on that. And it works on the other side as well. If I've looked at a stock, analyzed it, not bought it at, let's say, 300 rupees, I find it very difficult to buy it at 350. Right? Because I'm asking myself, what were you doing? What were you doing when this was at 300 and you looked at it? How did you miss it? And which is again not a very logical way of thinking, but that's my bias. That's how I tend to think about it as an intellectual win-loss, rather than being flexible and open-minded about it. I mean, that's something that I have learned about myself for past 10, 15 years. I'm working on it. I hope I'm getting better at it. But I think that is out behaving. I mean, I have been bullheaded about cyclical stocks and seen them be down 30% because I just wasn't willing to read the writing on the wall, or maybe I was willing to read the writing on the wall, but not accept it. So I'm being very candid here. But yeah, those are certain things that you need to be careful about. I mean, in fact, if you have somebody who you can talk to on a regular basis, and if there's some person who you respect, I think that friend, counselor, guide, call him or her, whatever, will actually be able to do this much better for you, right? Because your personal biases creep in very deeply when you have bought or sold something. And when there is somebody else who says, hey, listen, buddy, let me do this, it's a bit easier for you because you don't have to accept that defeat. Somebody else has done it on your behalf. So I think you just need to be aware of your biases. You just need to, when markets are at euphoric levels, right? You're making a lot of money. How are you feeling? Right? Is your risk appetite suddenly become really high? When the markets are down, when your stocks are down, how are you feeling? How are you reacting? You have come across a new piece of information. I mean, how are you reacting? And it'll probably be end of the day, because during the markets you cannot do this. But at the end of the day, you can just sit back and think about thinking. How you have thought about things, and that will help you start out behaving over time.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think your idea about people talking to either friends, mentors, or whoever they can, who can actually tell them about your biases. I think that's a great one to do. I mean, some of us do that, but not many people. People are really shy of talking about their mistakes generally. But it's very important to that. Yeah. Let's dwell more into your whole investment. How do you look at your investments, your level of concentration parameters, say management quality? What are the parameters you look at? What weightage you usually give to a particular one? Let's talk a bit more in detail.
Sure. So let me first talk about the portfolio construction, and then then decide. Then they tell you about what stocks to buy. Right? So if you think about the portfolio, there are two elements in every portfolio. Right? There's the name of the stock and how much weight do you put in. Right? Those are the portfolio management. Now, my view is that I'm not somebody who likes to spray and pray. Right? I mean, I like concentrated portfolios, wherein at least I have a semblance of control over what I own. There are no blind spots in the portfolio. My rule of thumb for any smart person is anywhere between 30 to 50 stocks. 50 is at the higher end. But if you are one person running a portfolio and you really want to do a good job of running it, I don't think you should have more than 30 stocks. And 30 is also, I would say, but if you have a team of analysts where you can farm out certain sectors or certain parts, that's fine. I don't know how people manage 150, 200 stock portfolios because they start resembling an index. Right? There is no superior thing there. So I have always said that in a portfolio, an institutional portfolio, max cap is 50 stocks. I want to own less than 50 stocks. At most times, we have been able to keep that number between 30 and 40. What that means is, by definition, your stock weight is about 2.5%, and average stock weight is about 2.5% if you own 40 stocks in the portfolio. Now, you have to be able to build that conviction that you will be able to take at least a 3%, if not more, bet on a certain stock in the portfolio. You have to consider for liquidity, you have to consider for market cap. Obviously, those are risk parameters. That if things go wrong, will you be able to get out in time? Is it too illiquid and things like that? But those are the broad things on portfolio construction. When I used to never like 1% positions. I used to never like 1.5%. What are we even doing here? I mean, even if let's say that stock doubles in 3 years, it's going to add only 1%, right? 1% doubling is just 1%. If you're so confident, you've done all the hard work and you think that this stock deserves a place in the portfolio, it would rather be 2.5 to 3%, if not more. So I've always sided on the side of having concentrated, high conviction portfolios. Now, what goes into the portfolio? So I believe in keeping the funnel as wide as possible. So as I talked about it, I look at some of the high frequency indicators from the macroeconomic standpoint, and those become idea generations. I look at quant screens. I read something somewhere. I speak to friends. Anyway, that pool of ideas, the pool of names, you should keep it as broad as you can. You should not shut your mind out to a lot of things. You should keep it as broad as you can. And for every aspiring analyst or every young analyst, what I tell them is, if I tell you an investing philosophy, and our investing philosophy is a growth quality investing philosophy, I will look for earnings growth in excess of 15%, ROEs in excess of 15%, if not today, at least in the foreseeable future, and a path towards going there. And what I used to tell analysts is that if I give you a name of a stock which you haven't heard in your life before, you should in 24 hours be able to tell me whether this is worth pursuing further or has to be discarded. Right? So that used to be my single point KRA to any analyst, saying that, okay, here is a name. You don't have time to do any analysis paralysis. Collect whatever information you want to. In the next 24 hours, you need to tell me whether to just jump this or do we explore this further. You don't tell me buy or sell. And then you start. So you have a wide enough funnel. You have a fairly fast filter of able to churn these names out, which shortens the funnel very quickly. And then you start your actual analysis process, which is, what is the real competitive advantage of this company or the sector? I mean, what is it that you still think you will be able to write with conviction 5 years, 10 years from now as being the competitive advantage of this company? Right? Let's say if we go back to any of the brands, right? I mean, will this brand exist 5 years from now? And for most good brands, you are able to say with conviction, yeah, this brand will exist and it will have a pull. So you start with the competitive advantages. Will the distribution network which is there today, will it exist? Will it have the same pull? So you start there. Then you try and put the context of the stock in the cycle. What's happening over the next 12 to 18 months or 18 to 24 months, as I talked about earlier. And then you juxtapose that with what the market expects to happen, right? And there's a great book by Michael Mauboussin called Expectations Investing, about how you can read market expectations and then try and write your rationale as where do you differ from consensus, rather than saying, this is what I feel, right? Because that's how money is made. Money is made by betting for or against odds. If I tell you, so you tell me what is an easier question to answer. How many cars will Maruti sell in the next year? Or I think Maruti will sell X cars in next year. Do you think it will be X plus or X minus? And so I think the second question is an easier question to answer. And a lot of people miss that part out because the market is already giving you odds. And with an India-England test match on, what is the probability that England will win or India will win? To compute it bottom up is extremely difficult. Right? I mean, you'll have to do a ton of things: the form, the pitch, the weather, God all knows. If you go to Ladbrokes or whatever is the betting site in England these days, they'll be able to give you odds, which will have an implied probability. Now the odds will imply that the chances of India winning this test match is 40%. Now to just say that you think it's 42 or you think it's 38. And that makes it an easier question than computing bottom up that this number is 43%. Yeah, so that's a long answer, but that's been that's the stock and the portfolio construction approach.
And how do you look at the industries? I mean, in terms of concentrating into particular sector, or you look at across industry, pick up best stocks in the industry?
Yeah, so we've looked across sectors. I mean, there are certain sectors which by definition are more secular, who can stocks that can remain in the portfolio for longer time. And there are cyclical stocks. One of the stocks that we bought in early 2014 was Ashok Leyland, knowing fully well that this is a deeply cyclical stock because it's a commercial vehicle company. And at some point in time, we will have to sell it. We'll have to decide at what point. But this seems like something which can give you disproportionate fast return in the next 2 to 3 years, which it did. So we really don't think in specific sector terms, but we think about what are the steady compounders in the portfolio today. HDFC Bank is a discovered 15% growth, 15% ROE name. It's a discovered name. It will be a core of your portfolio. It will be there. But there will be maybe two or in a 10 stock portfolio, which as I mentioned is a foreign portfolio in India. In a 10 stock portfolio, you probably have the liberty to buy 2 or 3 stocks, which are not there, which are not 15% ROE, 15% earnings today. But if certain things or your rationale falls in place, they will be there 3 years from now. So this was, let's say, the case with ICICI Bank 3 years ago when there was a CEO change and things were going through things. I mean, it was one of the stocks that did not have that profile when we bought it. It was Apollo Hospitals, right? So it was neither an earnings growth, neither an ROE story at that point in time. Because it was the classic, as I said, the classic supply side being a step function and demand side being a much more smoother function. You set up new hospitals, your cost structure goes for a toss, and by the time the hospitals start filling up, you have more and more patients, more and more therapies. That's when the real money starts getting made. So you have to balance your portfolio between the secular and the cyclical, and it's up to you how you decide how much of that you want. So that's the broad portfolio construct on sectors. You don't think about sectors in absolute terms. You think about the characteristics of those sectors and how you want to view a portfolio around that.
Apart from HDFC Bank, what has been your longest investment you've held for a very long period?
So personally, I wrote about it in the Bloomberg column. So personally, the first serious investment I made was in 2011 in a company called Chola Investments. It was at that point in time a turnaround company. The book value hadn't grown for 3 years in a row. They were licking their wounds from losses in personal finance business, etc., etc. And I still own it. So personally, I have held it for almost 10 years to date. I bought it in August 2011. Professionally, as I said, HDFC Bank was one. We have owned Eicher Motors for a fairly long time. So we bought Eicher Motors in I think 2009. We held it all till 2018, 2019 almost. So that has been a holding in the portfolio, did really well for us for a fairly long time. Those are the two names which have been kind of very sticky in the portfolio for the longest time.
Okay. So you recently called your, investment journey as moving away from like Hubbard-driven investor to one who believes in, lethargy bordering on sloth. What's your thought on this whole active versus passive investment? Probably there's two different things, but what's your thought?
Sure. So when I said Hubbard-driven investor, that's because this was at the age of 20, and I really didn't have the chops or the wherewithal or the ability, faculty, call it whatever you want, to understand the workings of the market. And then what you do is then you tend to rely on some so-called learned market friends who in hindsight you realize are not learned at all, and tend to take tips and yarn from them and try to follow them and see what they're doing till you lose your shirt, and that's when the realization dawns. So I started there. Like I think most people, so none of the retail investors that I know, or at least who have been my peers, started out reading by Intelligent Investor by Ben Graham. Very few people start out investing by doing that. I mean, you start by dirtying your hands in the pit, and then you learn. I mean, I think that's a much faster way to learn than learning Graham's net formula and not knowing when and where to apply it. I started like this. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of new investors coming to the market over the last 12, 24 months. And they're learning by doing, which I think is a much better, although riskier way of learning investing. And over time, then I realized, and I think, as I said again, I said earlier, the one faculty that you should have as an investor is not IQ, is temperament and the ability to self-analyze dispassionately. Right? I mean, you have to be able to call yourself out, saying, "Hey, listen, this is your thought pattern. This is what has cost you the investment. It never costs. It's never analytical. It's very rarely an analytical mistake. It's mostly a behavioral mistake."
Yeah.
Rather than an analytical mistake, right? So you should be able to call that out. So that's where I kind of gravitated toward trying to figure things out. On the active versus passive, I feel that if you are somebody who's not going to devote a lot of time figuring out financial markets, figuring out stocks, figuring out where to invest, or even doing basic mutual fund research, I think a passive fund is the best for you, right? Where you're broadly mimicking market returns, not paying too much fees for it. You don't have the time, inclination, or even the wherewithal to figure out. You are a busy sports person. That is what you want to do. And you don't want to take too much risk, but you want equity exposure because some of it is in fixed income. I'm sure some of it is in real estate. You want some equity exposure, not too much. And over long time periods, 5, 7, 10, 15, 20 years, the Indian market has returned somewhere between 10 to 15% in nominal terms. And that is something to keep in mind. It is handily beats fixed income returns, not on short time frames. Right? You have to at least give it 5 years, one more than that. And if that is the expected return from the asset class and you're just allocating money to different asset classes, I think passive is the best way to go. If you have some more time, some more inclination, some more wherewithal, knowledge, whatever, then you can start looking at active management through an intermediary, like a mutual fund, like a PMS, like an AIF, and try to get some more market return plus. Right? So 10 to 15 is what the market is offering you. You're trying for a plus 2-3% by giving money to somebody who's doing it really well. And then there's a way to pick which investor is better, how to do it, what time frames, etc. And if you're consumed by markets and that's all you want to do, right? If markets is your breath, markets is your life, then you should be doing personal investing directly, committing at least, if not all, a significant amount of your time and effort towards learning the market, and then you can invest directly in stocks, try to understand, rather than doing khabar or anything of that sort. That is how you should think about equity investing. But I would say that every individual has to have some equity exposure, because over fairly long periods of time, even adjusted for volatility, it gives better return than fixed income, at least in India.
I've always seen and I've believed that everybody starts as a very active investor, then they start losing money, then they become totally passive, then they start learning, and then they become a little bit more active. So I think it's a cycle. Everybody goes.
It's like an S curve.
Yeah, it is indeed. Now let's come to the recent IPOs, right? We are seeing like Zomato's and all those of the world, and this is fairly new for India, where they're all loss-making companies now. They have a very good market share, probably expected to do well over the period. How should one assess such models? I mean, especially for the retail investor I'm talking about.
On the retail side, what I have seen is, I mean, in general, I've seen that people who are buying into these IPOs, I've seen broadly two types. One type is the levered IPO investor, right? The investor doesn't care what the name of the IPO is. The only thing he or she cares about is what is the gray market premium and what is the interest that I will have to pay on the money that I'm borrowing to invest in this IPO. If A is greater than B, I'm going to invest. For all you know, it is Raj Singhal Private Limited. It is IPOing. I don't care what the company does. I just want to flip it on day one, try and make some money, and be done with it. The other set of investors are people who are taking a big picture view basically on India, right? Basically on the way this market will grow. I mean, you had, let's say, you put it the example of Zomato, and I think Ashwath Damodaran wrote a great piece on it. I mean,
Yep,
forget
he
that he
did.
put a number of 41 as the
Yeah,
face value
40.
for.
Yeah, I put a number of
Yeah,
40 on that. Yeah.
you can debate about the
Yeah.
valuation, but I think he put it well when he said that at the end of it, this is not so much about Zomato as it is about India. It is
Yeah.
about how you see this country developing on various axes of mobile penetration, of new users, of orders per user, and Zomato being able to capture other markets, etc. So you have to be either a worm that you don't care what the company is, I'm going to flip this out damn thing, it's just a price movement thing for me, or you have to really be out at 30,000 feet, right, to be able to take a 10-year view on these things. Anywhere in the middle, if you are telling me I want to trade this, I mean, I'm going to buy this based on F23 EV EBITDA, I'll say that you're fooling yourself, right? There is no way, there is no investment or valuation textbook that will help you justify into these companies on an F23 EV EBITDA. So you have to be either of these two to be able to build this conviction. I'm not saying it's right, wrong, but you have to, once you're buying into something, and forget the IPO flippers, let's not talk about them. I mean, there is no science there. But if you're going to buy into this, I think, or any investment that you're going to buy into it, I would say do your own research, because that's the only thing that will help you have conviction when inevitably things will go bad. If you have bought something based on hearsay, at the first sign of trouble, you're going to run away. And as you said, right, the first active investors make the most losses. When they get into the market, they buy something which is like really overheated, and they scram at the first sign of trouble. Uh, so just because something is asset heavy, asset light, I don't think you should bind yourself by too many of these labels. Uh, Try and analyze these companies first without looking at the numbers. And the numbers can come later. Try and understand the business model. Try and understand what they can become. Try and use some imagination on where they can go, given the India macro potential. And you can debate the macro potential as well. I'm not saying that is a given, but don't get bogged down because, oh, this is loss making, I don't care, or, oh, this is where India will go to, I don't even need to look at numbers. Don't take that extreme view to start with. Try and understand how does, for any company for that matter, not just some of these new age companies, uh, understand how these companies make money. What are the balance sheet characteristics? What are the cash flow characteristics? And at what point in time do they start really making money? What needs to happen for them to start making money? And then figure out whether you see that happening in the foreseeable future or no. Uh, I think that's the way to go about it, rather than bucketing companies as asset heavy, asset light, or those things. So even, I mean, I'll admit I'm still excuse me, I still don't have fully formed views on these things. I mean, I understand the macro argument. I'm also a stickler. I'm also a bit of a purist for valuations. So I'm kind of torn between these two, and I'm dipping my toes. I'm also trying to develop my investment philosophy around these things. So I don't have an answer yet.
Okay. But you want to talk a little bit more about this whole asset heavy, asset light, and especially in the context of where we are and where, so far the capex has been pretty slow. A lot of has been, there's been big deleveraging going on in the Indian corporates, but the commodity cycle being high, people are expected to put on more capacities and all in coming years. How does one look at that?
I think, and the best time to invest in an asset heavy model is at the turn of the cycle. It's very simple. And the logic behind there is that you already have assets in place which are utilized at a fairly low level. As things turn, utilizations go up. A lot of the incremental revenue becomes your profit, and your profits grow multiple. I mean, think about it like a hotel, right? It has got 100 rooms. In the worst of COVID, only 5 were occupied. But as things open up and things start normalizing, maybe 50 will get occupied, maybe 70 will get occupied, maybe 90 will get occupied. And all the money that comes from those 50, 70, 90 rooms will all become profit, because the fixed cost you're either ways incurring for the upkeep of those hotels. So if you are convinced that this 10 occupancy is going to 90 occupancy, I think that's the time to invest in any kind of an asset heavy model. It can be multiplex, it can be hotels, it can be anything that has got even, or maybe a manufacturing unit that makes certain things, cement companies, steel companies, etc. So that's how that cycle of asset heavy versus asset light plays. And you want to be sure that you exit at the right time, because when things are going down, they go down with an equal speed, because now you have capacities and demand starting to wane. I would look at asset heavy models right now, because it would be foolish not to bet on normalization of some sort. But the framework or the thought process that I have over there is, let's say the pre-COVID demand levels for certain commodity or a sector were 100, right? If it was a COVID beneficiary, like let's say Zoom, that 100 went to 150. If it was, let's say, hurt by COVID, let's say like maybe airlines, that 100 went down to 50. But as things normalize, where do we end up versus the pre-COVID numbers, right? Is there going to be a structural shift within this cyclical upheaval? So the way I mean is that even after COVID normalizes, some part of meetings are going to become Zoom meetings, right? No matter what happens, not all meetings will go back to being 100% physical. So let's say Zoom started at 100 meetings before COVID. Its structural number now is already 125, if not higher. Right? Even when things are normal, even when everything reduces. And I'll argue the opposite for airlines, that all travel is not going to come back. Right? Even if things normalize and the pre-COVID demand was 100, you will probably go back from 50 to maybe 85, 90. Right? So the 50 to 85, 90 recovery is definitely there. And you have to, I mean, you can play that recovery, or Zoom going from, let's say, 150 to 120 will happen. But what you have to think about it, where does it stabilizes in a normal level? I would say that there is a permanent loss of demand and there is a permanent gain of demand in certain sectors. So even if you're saying, okay, asset heavy airlines, demand coming back, you need to be careful on where the last peak was versus where the next peak will be. And my argument is that the next peak will be lower than the last one.
And that's interesting. I like something you wrote, that it's very hard to fail if you aim high enough. Can you share your perspective for our listeners here on that?
Yeah, so there's a nice version of the quote. There is actually a better version which I wanted to use, but I decided not to. That is that if you aim for the moon, you end up hitting the street light. Which is what it means, right? That if you decide to have a big aim, and if you try hard enough for it, you will achieve something. You will achieve something which is better than where you started off at. So I wrote that in the context of my physical fitness journey, right? Like every guy going through a midlife crisis, I wanted to get six-pack abs, and that is what I started off with. I said, okay, I want to get six-pack abs. And I got a trainer, I got a dietitian, and for 2 months I was at it. At the end of the day, at the end of 2 months, I didn't get six pack, but I was in my best physical shape of my life, right? So in terms of weight, in terms of fat percentages, I was in my best adult. I think I was at my lowest adult weight, if I'm not wrong. So I had aimed impossibly high to get abs like John Abraham, but I ended up at a reasonable place, I would say. So although I don't have the six-pack abs, but I think I've reached a place of physical fitness, and which I hope will help me over the next few years, where I know how to work out, where I know how to eat right, I know how to maintain my fitness levels. I'm in a reasonable shape. So I've aimed high, and I have failed in the conventional sense of what I started to achieve, but I haven't failed completely, is what I would think.
Okay, that's interesting. So I read your wrote on generational shift in consumption and debt. So what are your insights you gathered on Gen Z spending, investing, saving patterns? How different they are from the previous generations?
No, absolutely. I mean, another thing that we talked about earlier was, what are the trends you think will be in play for the next decade and things like that. So I think an easy answer is watch what the young people are doing. It will always give you clues to what the next decade or next 15, 20 years be like. So my niece, actually my wife's niece, has her birthday this week. She turns 18. And she's dying to get a digital wallet. You need to be 18 to have either a UPI or some sort of a digital wallet. She has a bank account. She now just wants two things. She wants to have a Demat account along with it, and she wants a UPI, either a Google Pay or something of that sort, on her 18th birthday. This is very different from what I wanted from my 18th birthday. Right? So she understands EMIs, she understands buy now, pay later, she understands debt. She may not understand the spreadsheet behind it, but she knows that this exists. And that, I think, is a big generational shift from your attitude towards, in general, financialization, right? I mean, I know my parents' most sophisticated financial investment was a fixed deposit, and nothing else. So we used to have some cash at home, some gold and jewelry, and fixed deposit. That's it. Their entire lives, this was their investment pattern. They never took a home loan. They never took any sort of loan. They put money together, friends and family, bought a house, still have that house. So that is what, so it's extremely, I would say, almost primitive financial journey, their entire lives. They didn't explore asset classes, nor did they explore liabilities. And I think if you ask me, this generation, the one big thing that I see is just being open to this idea of finance, right? Because finance is percolating through the different socioeconomic classes as well. People are very, very aware about money, finances. I mean, the very fact that you are thinking about something like a social finance, I think it's just a sign of times that people not only want to be invested in finance, they want to have a social element.
Yep.
So I think if you ask me for the next 10 years, we have a starting point which is very attractive in terms of just the credit to GDP growth. Just to credit to GDP level for retail. I mean, that's on the liability side. And even on the asset side of things, I mean, despite the explosion in the demat accounts, despite the explosion in the mutual fund folios, we're still scratching the surface. I don't think we have deepened anywhere. I mean, none of those numbers are more than 100 million, if I remember right.
Yep.
Be it income tax filers, be it demat accounts, be it
it's probably 60% of that is still.
Even credit cards last I checked was some 50 odd million, and we are a population of 1.3. So I would say that this deepens, right? Just more finance, both on the asset and the liability side of your life, more products. It just deepens across. So at the top, at the creamy layer, there is a wealth management. Then there is a plain vanilla mutual fund kind of a product. Then you go to slightly simpler products for younger population, for small savings and things like that. So I think that will be the next. It's not just, I wouldn't restrict it only to, let's say, credit to GDP, or will banks do better or banks do worse. I think wherever finance in a way is touching lives, and that can be investing, that can be insurance, that can be different asset classes, intermediaries, and things like that. I think I would really look at all of these, and technology that enables and makes this easier. I would really look at this, because there is a tremendous headway to grow. There's a tremendous space for you to grow, just because the starting points are so low. And the fact that there is a attitudinal push towards this. Debt is no longer a 4-letter word. It's no longer taboo. So there's an old saying in Marathi, which my mom used to frequently quote, like, a rupee of debt should prick in your foot like a thorn, right? That used to be the attitude, that it should be.
You want to say that
so
in Marathi?
Embarrassing.
You want to say that in Marathi?
So she used to say, karza ha payatla kata hai. So karza is debt.
Yeah.
Payatla kata is like a thorn which pricks you in your foot. It has to be that embarrassing, uncomfortable, humiliating, call it what you want. But it is to be avoided at all costs. You should never have any sort of debt, which is a very extreme way of operating. I'm not saying that you lever yourself to the hilt and go bust. I'm not saying the pendulum should swing the other way. But at a country, as I said, at the country of size of 1.3 billion, $3 trillion of GDP, growing 10%, that pendulum moving is a huge shift, right? It will take, obviously excesses will happen. Things will happen on the other side. And that's a piece I wrote in 2017, where there were I saw two shops adjacent to each other. One had a hoarding saying loan pay phone, which means that you can buy a phone with an EMI by taking a loan. And there was a shop next door which said phone pay loan, which means that you can get a loan on a phone call. You don't have to go anywhere, right? So there was phone pay loan and loan pay phone. And those two kind of set me thinking that what is this? When I grew up in an age where all grocers used to have something outside their shop saying Aaj Nagad Kal Udhar,
Yeah.
And today we are having seminars on buy now, pay later. So it's a huge shift, and I've seen both. So it's less than 25, 30 years. So this attitudinal shift, I mean, yeah, I mean, if I speak to the elders in the family, they are still like, this is going to end in tears. This can't be good. I mean, I don't see how this will. But yeah, but I see the younger people. I mean, my niece, apart from the Demat account, she's also angling for an add-on credit card, which she's not going to get. But that's how the shift is happening.
Now, so the loan pay phone and phone pay loan, that itself is probably a good flywheel to think about. But any actionable ideas right now on this? Because some of these things people are developing, right? Like what we are developing or whatever, it will take a long time to come to the market. For people who are investing in public markets, any actionable ideas for them from this trend?
I'll refrain from mentioning specific stocks.
Yeah. Okay.
But what I will say, what I will say is this. I mean, this is what I mean. This is the first piece I wrote. I mean, 3-4 months ago for Bloomberg. Is watch the young people and think about categories as demographically advantaged and demographically challenged. Right. So I gave examples like gold is a demographically challenged category. The young people no longer want to buy a lot of gold. They're not fascinated by it. They don't see it as a store for value, at least in most part. The young people are fascinated by crypto. Young people are fascinated by digital currencies. Right. So right, wrong, how will this end? Let's not get there. But this is demographically advantaged. This is demographically challenged, and you will see this in various walks of life. Where different categories, I mean, this thought started when I ended up attending over the same weekend. I attended a Marathi play and a Marathi stand-up comedy show at the same venue, same time. One was on a Friday, the other was on a Sunday. One was on a Saturday, one was on a Sunday. Same ticket pricing. For the Marathi play, I was one of the youngest guys in the audience. It was a classic old play which was being remade with a new cast. And for the stand-up comedy show, I was by far the oldest member of the audience. Right, so I instantly thought that here is a category which is demographically challenged, which is the play, and here is a category which is demographically advantaged, which is the stand-up. And then that's kind of started the thought process. I mean, are there other categories which are like this? And then things started coming, and not just related to financial markets. I mean, if you go to a temple today, you will struggle to find black hair there. So I think religion is demographically challenged. But if you go to a spirituality / wellness / meditation camp, you will hardly find any gray hair because that is demographically advantaged. So I think if you use that framework, you will start seeing a lot of things. I mean, in terms of, but as I said, when it comes to penetration of financing or financials or financial assets, I think just look at the technology side of it as well, and how it is making things easier. Just see regulation. I mean, how it is making things easier for you to now open a bank account in probably less than 15 minutes. So I would say look at the enablers on that side. Look at the new things that are coming. Look for disintermediation. I would still say there is a lot of fat fee that is creating friction between the person who wants, the consumer of financial services, and the provider of the financial services. Look for opportunities for disintermediation. It will happen a lot. Already happening with mutual fund brokerages, for instance. Already happening with a lot of other people where there are middlemen. So yeah, those are the broad areas that you should look at.
Religion and politician have a knack of surviving thousands of years, so they'll figure out a way of going where the trend is, where the market is. Yeah. So let's talk about China. And we recently wrote an article on the whole China, tech, what's happening. Do you have any thoughts on your thoughts on China? I mean, how do you look at what's happening there?
Yeah. So not a China expert. I don't know what really is happening or what are the motivations of what is really happening there. But the one thing that I can say is that as an investor, this scares me, right? I mean, if the entire existence of companies can be changed with the stroke of a pen, as an investor, I worry. As an investor, that's going to lurk in the back of my mind. At the same time, there's this very rosy narrative being painted that the money that is leaving China is going to all come to India, as if that's our birthright. That if you are selling a Chinese tech stock, you per force need to buy Zomato. That's not true. So I mean, it's very difficult to, when you get an FII inflow number or you get an FDI inflow number, it is very difficult to label intentions behind it. Nobody's going to, no FI is going to tell you that, hey, I sold China yesterday and with that money, I bought India. You can see some changes happening, but I think let's not trick ourselves into the complacency that the money now has no other place to go because China, the tech sector, or especially the high flying tech companies are no longer investor favorites. So all money is now going to, I think that's a very almost arrogant way of thinking. So what has happened amongst investors' minds is they're still worried on how this plays out. It's scary. For any investor, that your entire investment case is basically turned on its head with one paper that comes out, and there is no mechanism to challenge it. That is what I get to hear from my Chinese friends or people who invest in China. But I would stop myself from thinking that automatically means that this is my place in the sun.
I've written earlier on Twitter that never get too bullish on India because of the politicians, and never get too bearish on India because of the resilience of people. So just be there in the middle.
Absolutely. I think there's a great quote which I like, which is by my former boss Ruchir Sharma, which is, India has a knack of disappointing both the optimist and the pessimist.
Absolutely.
So I think if you keep that in your mind, I think that will serve you really well.
So our show is called Breaking Investment Stereotypes. Any investment stereotypes you want to break or talk about?
I think, and it's a very general thing. I deliberately didn't think about what I was going to say. I know the name of your show. But in investing, there is this tendency to come across or to portray yourself as, I know it all. And one of the most difficult but yet important things to say while you are investing is, I don't know.
Sure.
So as long as, Buffett calls it differently as circle of competence. But if you can say, I don't know, I think that itself puts you ahead of probably 90% of investors. So if you ask this China question to anybody today, right, who's in the investing field, and do this as a social experiment, I'm sure 9 people out of 10 will tell you something. Or maybe, to put it differently, you can try this as a Twitter poll. Just ask there, is Zomato overvalued? And put 3 options: yes, no, I don't know. And I don't know will be less than 10%. Of
course.
Right. So I think having to have a view on everything is just impossible and stifling, and I would say injurious to your financial health. I would say the one myth that everyone has, that people who come on TV know everything about everything. They don't.
Yep.
I think I don't know is something that you should practice saying, cultivate it as a great investing habit.
Yep. That's interesting. Let's talk something about your personal life as well. And you have many interests outside investing, but I think something which is close to you mentioned that you did in your sabbatical as well. You went to Gary Kirsten's, to learn more about cricket. And I guess you are a spin bowler, right? So
yes,
tell us more about that. And also, actually, tell us more. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Sorry. Finish your question, Raj. Sorry.
No. So that is one thing. And second, I also want to pick up on this whole Vipassana experience, because that is something I really wanted to do and I've never done it. So let's talk about both of them.
Yeah. So let me talk about Vipassana first. So Vipassana, a lot of people, when I told them I'm going for a Vipassana meditation, they were like, what's wrong? I think there's nothing wrong. Why do you, another myth, right? That you go to Vipassana only when you're looking for some sort of a spiritual enlightenment / you're going through some upheaval in your life. I said, no, I don't have any of those issues. I'm not going there to solve a problem. My basic logic to do that was that I was trying to establish a meditation practice for myself. I was trying to say that I want to do 30 minutes of some sort of a meditation every day, or as close to every day as I can. And the thinking there was that if I run a marathon once, running a 5K daily will not be a big problem. That was the thinking. So I said, okay, let me go and do this for. So I wasn't looking for any enlightenment, any deep insights, anything, nothing. So I just said, this sounds fun. I'd just come out of this digital minimalism, digital detox kind of a thing. This sounded like to take it one step forward. And I found the experience to be amazing. It was like a terrific experience. In terms, I mean, I don't want to give spoilers here for people who will be doing Vipassana going forward. Suffice to say that I've continued with some of the practices. I mean, it's now woven into my meditation practice. But yeah, I mean, I would strongly, I'm a strong believer and subscriber of this. But again, as I said, go into this with the right expectations, with the right. Don't expect to become Shaktiman or this is not a Bodhi tree under which you sit and suddenly at the end of 10 days you'll have a halo over your head. A lot of people look out for that, and then they get disappointed by it. So I said it's worth trying if you have some sort of an introspective inward part to your personality. I would say this is something that you will really enjoy.
Yeah. And
okay, the second part was on the cricket. Yeah, I mean, probably the best month of my sabbatical was. I mean, I wasn't sure if I'll be able to make it to South Africa, but thankfully things fell in place and I could fly to Cape Town. They were in the middle of their second wave and there was like a partial lockdown, but the cricket facilities were open for a limited number of people. And it was, yeah, I mean, it was a terrific experience, and there were some interesting life lessons to be drawn as well. And the one thing that surprised me is that they did not, I mean, at the academy, Gary himself or his staff, they did not try to make fundamental changes to who I was as a cricketer. So they didn't try to teach me entirely new things which I haven't ever done in my life. And the approach there was, you are what you are. Nobody has the perfect technique in the game. We will try and polish and try and ensure that with whatever skills, talent you have you've been playing for the past 25, 30 years, we'll try and make the most bang for the buck from it. Mm-hmm. So if let's say I've never played, I mean, this is going to get a bit technical, but if let's say I've never played the sweep shot in my life, I mean, I didn't learn to play the sweep shot there. But I have played the cut all my life, and we spent actually 3 sessions on how to play and place the cut shot better, and how to get the most bang for the buck from playing the cut shot better. I used to never bowl the googly. I didn't bowl the googly or the flipper. But the 2 or 3 variations that I used to bowl, we kept honing them much better. So I think the one thing which I realized that there's nothing called perfect, and that was what I heard on the first day itself, that cricket is not a perfect game. Don't try to make it one. So on the first day itself, I played a cover drive, which was like away from the body. Although I middled it reasonably well, but I played it really away from the body. And had it been a swinging wicket or something, it would have gone between bat and bat. And I kind of I was shaking my head in disappointment. And the coach is like, "That's a great shot. Why are you shaking your head in disappointment?" And I said, "But there is so much gap between bat and bat." He said, "Forget that. It's not a perfect game. This is a boundary." So I think that just changed. And the way Indian coaches, especially when I was growing up, it was all about being very textbookish, right? I mean, the bat and bat has to be really close to each other, no gap, etc. And I was coming from that mindset, and this was very refreshing. And then this is it. So, so do you think Steve Smith has the perfect technique, or do you think Jasprit Bumrah's bowling action is textbook? Obviously, it's not, but it's probably the most effective bowler across formats today. So those were some of the interesting things. Great fun. I mean, if you put me on a cricket field, I can be there for 8 hours and not even bother about what time is it and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I didn't need
any insights you got from Gary from his experience with the India team. Did you meet him?
So I got to spend some time, not a lot of it, but I got to spend some time with him. And some of his insights with the team is that, I mean, at that level, I mean, about the Indian teams, at that level, you don't really need coaching. You need a friend. You need someone to talk to. I mean, and coming back to what I was saying earlier, right? I mean, once you have been an institutional investor, or you've been an investor for a fairly long time, you don't need help with a spreadsheet. You don't need somebody to tell you what the formula for DCF is. You need to be able to talk to somebody about what's in your mind, about what you're thinking, about what you're doing behaviorally. And I think Gary picked that really well. And he said that I tried to become a friend to everybody, rather than a coach. I mean, I tried to become a sort of a safe place for people to talk about what they're going through, what's in their minds, etc. And I think that's extremely insightful. I mean, a coach's natural tendency is to teach, right? A coach and teach come in the same breath. But you should also be able to know when not to teach, when just to listen. I found it to be very insightful.
Oh, actually, that's very interesting. Some of them can be used that with the kids as well, and I've grown up kids. So, uh,
Yeah.
yeah, coming towards the end of our, the recording, and it's very awesome. And you've been you're a writer, and I'm sure you're a great reader as well. Any book recommendations you want to give for our listeners?
So I'm assuming that, I mean, you have people who are cursorily interested at least in investing and
Yep.
finance and things like that. So I'll tell you the most impactful books that I read through my growing up career, which are related to investing in finance. So the first book which actually got me very intrigued by markets was a book called Random Walk Down Wall Street. It's written by a guy called Burton Malkiel, and it's just in a way a history of financial markets, right? I mean, starting from the South Sea bubble and the tulip bulb mania in Holland and things like that. So I got just really fascinated by this animal called markets. I mean, how can people pay those kind of crazy monies for essentially a plant, which is not even scarce, right? And how can people pay money for an IPO whose prospectus says that the company's business is so confidential that it can't be mentioned? So I was like, what is this? And these are all real life. I mean, these are real documents, and that really got me intrigued, right, about what the whole market is all about. So that was a book I felt I really liked. I've read through, not cover to cover, but I've read through obviously Benjamin Graham, which is and Buffett's newsletters are obviously rich with information. I read Howard Marks whenever I get time to. Another book which has been very impactful, as I said, is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. It's not strictly an investment book, but I mean, whatever my views today about thinking are kind of based on that book. So that I think is a very interesting book. An Audible book which I read was called Zebra in a Lion Country. It's written by a guy called Ralph Manger, who was called the dean of small cap investing, I think, in the 70s. And it's a very earthy book about what kind of, I mean, it's a practitioner's book. It is not very theoretical, and some of what he said in that book has stayed with him. He says that think about a man walking his dog from let's say Central Park to Fifth Avenue. Uh, People focus on where the dog is going. Right, the dog is going to be going left, right, here, there, everywhere. It's not going to walk in a straight line. The dog is going to be all over the place. But the key to focus is the man, right? Because the man holds the dog's leash, and the dog will eventually go where the man is going. And he says that is fundamentals in stock prices. Right? The stock prices will keep darting in all directions, right? And all of us are focused on the dog. But the dog is in the short term doing really random things. What you really need to focus is on the man, right? Because eventually the dog will end up where the man ends up. You have to focus on where the. So I think that is a great analogy of how to think about prices and fundamentals and businesses, and that kind of has stuck with me. So that was a very interesting book that I read. I mean, I generally tend to. I mean, I like reading stuff by practitioners. I don't like to read a lot of theory. I like to get into the practitioner's insight. One of my first days at Fidelity, I had the good fortune of meeting Anthony Bolton, and who was a celebrated Fidelity fund manager. Good fortune of interacting with him, and his book, I think, Investing Against the Tide, is a practitioner's guide to what an institutional investor should do. It is not about some obtuse gyan about some stuff. I mean, how to conduct a meeting, how to ask questions to the management. Very practitioners, very earthy, very implementable. So I gravitate towards those kind of books rather than just big theories or big insights about markets.
It's very interesting. I like that the man and the dog analogy. Very interesting, that one. We're coming to the last question here, and this is the question we ask everyone. You're fairly young still, but what advice will you give to your 20-year-old Swanan?
Interesting. I would say ask more questions. That is, I mean, if you ask me in one sentence, that is what I would I would tell myself, because as a 20-year-old, you have a lot of received wisdom. And when I say received wisdom, I mean things that have been told to you either by your parents or by your seniors, or by people who you kind of look up to. And you have been told that this is the way to do things, or this is the way to lead your life. This is the way how careers progresses. So you have a lot of received wisdom, but you don't have so much organic wisdom, something that you have figured out for yourself, something that you have realized by doing things. And the best way to bridge that gap between received and organic wisdom is to ask questions. And the most important question that you should, and as a 20-year-old, you are excused all questions, right? A 20-year-old is meant to ask questions. And I think a lot of 20-year-olds don't use that opportunity. Maybe for because you feel embarrassed that will somebody think that I'm stupid. Why is he or she asking so many questions? So I would say question all received wisdom. That doesn't mean that all received wisdom is wrong, but don't take it as received just because somebody in a position of authority is telling you that. So I would say ask more questions, and ideally a lot of it should be why.
That's interesting, and that's a great place to end our conversation. I really enjoyed our conversations, one. So thanks a lot for coming here.
Terrific. Thanks, Raj. Thanks for this opportunity.